There are stories that were never meant to be spoken aloud, accounts of betrayal and ritual so soaked in silence that even history tried to bury them beneath polite archives and polished sermons. Yet here you are, pressing play, daring to listen. I will warn you, once these words pass into your ears, you will not be able to forget them. They will linger, turning over in the dark hours of the night when silence grows heavy. Before we begin our descent, like this video, subscribe, and comment the name of the place you're watching from. Because this is not entertainment. This is inheritance. You will soon understand why. October 13th, 1841. Trinity Episcopal Church in Hartford, Connecticut. A place where marble floors echoed the boots of men convinced of their righteousness, where polished pews gleamed beneath candlelight, and where 19-year-old Bridget O'Sullivan entered in white lace, ready to bind her life to one of Hartford's most eligible heirs. Guests whispered admiration, though beneath it hummed another current, low and biting. The Irish girl had risen too far, too fast. Her groom, William Peton, was the adored son of Eleanor, known as Eloanina in private circles, a widow who ruled her mansion on Prospect Street with the cold precision of a general. But there are mothers, and then there are women like her. Women who see sons not as children of flesh, but as extensions of empire, guardians of legacy, protectors of a family name sharpened like a blade over decades. To Eleanor, her son's intended bride was not a daughter-in-law, but an invader. Bridget was Catholic. She was Irish. She was poor by birth. That morning, as Bridget adjusted her veil and prepared to sip from the chalice of ceremonial wine, Eleanor sat in the pews with a composure that came from careful rehearsal. She knew exactly what was about to unfold. The organ swell masked the first cough. At first, some guests thought Bridget was overcome by nerves. But when her face contorted, when her hands clawed at the air as if grasping for something invisible, when her body convulsed and foam laced her lips, a silence dropped like lead over the congregation. She fell, collapsing against the altar rail. The groom cried out, rushing forward, but it was too late. Her final whisper seared itself into the memory of all present. The wine, it burns. In the hours after, while William knelt beside the lifeless body of his bride, Eleanor moved among guests with the steadiness of a matron in mourning. Her eyes glistened, her hands shook at all the proper moments, yet her heart remained stone. The whispers began almost immediately. Tragic weakness, fainting nerves, perhaps consumption. None suspected the true hand at play. What authorities uncovered 3 days later would chill Hartford's polite society, but they would never speak the truth aloud. For the poison that had ended Bridget's life was no accident. It had been purchased with deliberation, handled with patience, and administered in a holy place, as if to remind all present that sanctity itself could be twisted into a weapon. Eleanor had planned each step, each motion, with the precision of someone who understood not only the art of murder, but the psychology of spectacle. But why? Why would a mother destroy her son's happiness at the altar in front of God and man? To answer that, we must step backwards into a Hartford swelling with immigrants, into drawing rooms filled with whispers of purity and decline, into a city divided by old money and new blood. We must step into Eleanor's mind itself, a labyrinth where love and control fused into obsession. And it is there, in the shadow of ambition, that the poison was first brewed. Hartford in 1841 was not the quiet New England village its spire suggested. It was a city swollen by the Industrial Revolution, its river thick with steamboats, its air salted by smoke that rose from new factories. Immigrants, especially the Irish, poured into these mills, filling tenements with restless hunger, their accents a constant reminder to established families that the old order was slipping. Among Hartford's elite, the Pettons sat enthroned. Eleanor Petton, widowed 6 years by the sudden death of her husband Jonathan, controlled a fortune of $40,000, a sum that placed her among the wealthiest women in Connecticut. But wealth alone was not enough. She had been born to a merchant's family, and though she had clawed her way upward by marrying into shipping and insurance, she never forgot the disdain in the eyes of Hartford's oldest families. They had tolerated her because Jonathan expanded the fortune, because her wit could not be denied, because her son William was a jewel to be polished. But behind their polite nods lurked the old suspicion. She was not truly one of them. Her entire life became a campaign to erase that whisper. Each dinner party hosted with perfect cutlery, each alliance struck at Ladies' Aid Society meetings, each calculated gesture to prove her refinement. It was all a battle against humiliation. And William, her only child after 3 miscarriages, was both weapon and shield. She had raised him as her miracle, shaping his education, molding his speech, steering his every friendship. When Jonathan died, Eleanor did not simply become a widow. She became the architect of William's future. His success, his marriage, his children, these would vindicate her. Through him, she would be unassailable. But fate has a taste for irony. For William did not choose a daughter of Hartford's patrician families. He chose Bridget O'Sullivan, the Irish seamstress with auburn hair and emerald eyes who read poetry by candlelight and asked questions at public lectures that silenced entire halls. William fell not for status, but for fire. Bridget's words challenged him. Her courage disarmed him, and her lack of guile pierced through the suffocating etiquette of his world. She was everything Hartford society despised, and everything William craved. Eleanor discovered their secret on a July afternoon. She had arrived at his office with a pitcher of lemonade and overheard his voice through the door. "I don't care about her approval anymore, Bridget. I love you, and that's what matters." Those words shattered her. She fled, trembling with rage. That evening at dinner, William confessed what she already knew. He intended to marry Bridget. Eleanor smiled, her hand trembling only slightly as she lifted her glass. "How wonderful, dear," she said, her voice a mask. Inside, she burned. In that moment, her war began. She investigated the O'Sullivans, learned of their Catholic loyalties, their labor sympathies, their whispers of poverty. She watched Bridget at public events, hoping to see vulgarity, but instead she found elegance, intelligence, warmth. And the more Eleanor observed, the more she realized the danger. Bridget was not merely tolerable, she was magnetic. Hartford's elite began to soften toward her, drawn by her poise. Even Eleanor's critics admitted the girl had grace. This was the true threat. Not that Bridget was Irish, but that she might succeed where Eleanor had fought all her life. If William married her, Bridget would enter the Petton household not as an intruder, but as a beloved bride, winning hearts Eleanor could never command. In Bridget's smile, Eleanor saw her own erasure. By September, when William announced his engagement publicly, Eleanor had exhausted the weapons of persuasion. She had argued, pleaded, threatened. Nothing worked. Her son's love for Bridget was absolute, and so she turned to a different arsenal, one hidden in her late husband's files. Among his correspondence lay letters from a New York associate detailing chemical compounds, arsenic oxide among them. White crystalline powder, tasteless in wine, fatal within moments. Difficult to detect, nearly impossible to prove. On October 8th, Eleanor boarded a train to New York. She returned with a small parcel wrapped in plain paper, tucked into her traveling cloak. 5 days later, her son's bride would lift a chalice to her lips, and the Petton name would be preserved. But the preservation of legacy always exacts a cost. And as we pull deeper into this story, the line between devotion and destruction, between love and murder, begins to dissolve. The morning of October 13th broke with an eerie calm. Fog drifted low along the Connecticut River, muting the sound of steamboat whistles. Within the Peton mansion, Eleanor dressed in a gown of deep plum silk, her hair coiled with meticulous precision. She did not permit herself to tremble. She had rehearsed every detail. The lace gloves she slid over her hands had the faintest trace of powder beneath her nails, a whisper of the substance she had handled days earlier. Downstairs, William waited in his wedding attire, his joy unguarded, his smile radiant. To Eleanor, it was almost unbearable. His happiness felt like betrayal. She kissed his cheek, offering words of motherly affection that hid the steel in her voice. "You have chosen well, my son. Today will be perfect." At Trinity Church, the guests arrived in carriages that clattered against cobblestone. The pews filled with Hartford's most curious, merchants, matrons, and magistrates who had come as much to witness scandal as to celebrate union. They eyed Bridget with fascination as she walked the aisle. She was luminous, her veil catching the morning light like a halo, her emerald eyes lifted toward William with unshakable devotion. In that moment, even Eleanor felt the peril. If Bridget survived this day, she would not merely join their family, she would eclipse Eleanor entirely. The ceremony proceeded with solemnity. Vows were exchanged, voices trembled, hearts swelled. Then came the chalice, a ritual sip of wine, sanctified and symbolic. The goblet touched Bridget's lips, the liquid sliding down her throat. A pause, a flicker of unease across her face, then a cough. Within moments, her body convulsed. Screams erupted. William grasped her, crying her name. The priest froze in horror, unable to speak. Guests surged forward, some calling for physicians, others crossing themselves. And amid the chaos, Eleanor stood perfectly still, her hands clasped, her face arranged in a mask of maternal devastation. Yet inside, her mind was silent, cold, watching as her plan unfolded exactly as she had designed. Bridget collapsed at the altar, her gown pooling like spilled milk across the marble floor. White foam bubbled from her lips. Her final whisper, "The wine, it burns," seared through the church, silencing even the organist's frantic chords. And then stillness. Her body lay motionless, a bride frozen forever at the altar. William's cries shattered the silence. He clutched Bridget's lifeless form, shaking her as though he could summon her back. His anguish was unbearable to witness, yet Eleanor did not flinch. She reached forward, touching his shoulder, her voice measured. "My son, she is gone." In that moment, the church became a tomb. The air was thick with the scent of wax and panic. Guests whispered explanations, fainting nerves, sudden fever, divine punishment. But not one dared speak the true suspicion. For who, in that sanctuary, would accuse a grieving mother of orchestrating such horror? 3 days later, when Bridget's body was examined, traces of arsenic were discovered. Yet Hartford's authorities hesitated. To expose the truth would not only destroy one of its most prominent families, but also ignite riots among the growing Irish community. And so the official verdict was left ambiguous. A tragic collapse, perhaps poisoned, perhaps not. But William knew. His eyes, once filled with devotion, now burned with suspicion. And Eleanor, though she never confessed, saw in his gaze the shadow of accusation. She had preserved the Peton name. Yet in doing so, she had shattered her son's soul. The house on Prospect Street grew cold in the weeks that followed. The mirrors were draped, the hall silent except for William's footsteps pacing deep into the night. Eleanor told herself it had been necessary. But necessity is a cruel master, and the poison she had poured into her son's life would spread in ways she had not foreseen. In Hartford's parlors and coffee houses, whispers became currency. Some claimed Bridget had been cursed, struck down by divine disfavor for daring to marry above her station. Others swore it was consumption, hidden until the wedding day. But among the Irish, there was no doubt Bridget had been murdered. Rumors pointed toward Eleanor, though never allowed in polite company. Servants whispered in kitchens, workers murmured in taverns. They spoke of her icy demeanor, her obsession with preserving status, her disdain for immigrants. Some claimed she had been seen boarding the train to New York days before the wedding, returning with a package concealed in her cloak. But gossip alone could not pierce Hartford's fortress of respectability. Eleanor hosted luncheons, attended church, and maintained her role as grieving mother-in-law with flawless precision. William, however, was not deceived. He withdrew from society, refusing invitations, declining business meetings, avoiding friends. His once bright future dimmed beneath a cloud of grief. At night, he would lock himself in his study, poring over legal texts and chemical manuals, desperate to understand how Bridget had died. He traced shipments of arsenic, examined letters from his father's business associates, and pieced together a chain that pointed back to his own mother. Yet without proof, he remained silent, trapped between filial duty and unbearable suspicion. For Eleanor, the weeks became months, and with them came an unsettling transformation. She had expected relief, triumph even. She had believed that eliminating Bridget would restore order. Yet what she found was emptiness. The victory tasted of ash. She wandered her grand home, rooms echoing with absence, each corner haunted not by Bridget's ghost, but by William's silence. His eyes no longer softened when he looked at her. His words were few, clipped, and cold. She had preserved the Peton legacy, but she had lost the only soul she ever loved. Meanwhile, Hartford itself shifted. The Irish community, galvanized by Bridget's death, became more insular, more defiant. They whispered of betrayal, of Protestant plots, of justice denied. The tragedy at Trinity Church became legend, a story retold in crowded tenements as proof of the cruelty of the ruling class. And though no riot erupted, the wound festered. Hartford would never be the same. Behind closed doors, Eleanor wrestled with a truth darker than the poison she had poured. She had not only killed a girl, she had destroyed the one bond that tethered her to humanity. William was drifting from her, slipping beyond her reach, and no manipulation, no scheme could draw him back. Yet still, she told herself it had been necessary. Always that word, necessary. For in Eleanor's world, love was a currency to be sacrificed upon the altar of survival. And though she would never admit it aloud, some nights she dreamed of Bridget's emerald eyes, staring at her with something worse than hatred. Pity. It was then that Eleanor began to sense that the poison had not ended at the altar. It had followed her home, seeping into the walls, threading itself through her bloodline. And though she had silenced Bridget forever, she could not silence the truth. Every act of preservation is also an act of destruction, and the destruction was only beginning. Winter descended on Hartford with a cruel sharpness that year, as though the air itself conspired to punish those who still lingered in grief. Snow pressed against the windows of the Peton mansion, and the once bustling house became a mausoleum. Servants spoke in hushed tones, unwilling to disturb the silence. In the grand parlor, Eleanor sat by the fire, her face illuminated by flickering light, her hands clasped so tightly that the skin whitened at the knuckles. She had expected William to heal in time, to turn his grief inward until it hardened into resignation. But grief, when fed by suspicion, does not fade. It festers. He rarely spoke to her now. At meals, he picked at his food in silence, his eyes cast downward. When he looked at her, it was no longer with warmth but with a quiet, unbearable accusation. Eleanor tried to reach him through practical talk of business, of estates, of the family name, but he only nodded coldly, retreating afterward into solitude. It was during one of these silent dinners that William finally spoke. "I found Father's letters," he said, his voice calm but sharp enough to cut the air. Eleanor froze, the silver spoon suspended between bowl and mouth. "The letters from New York. About arsenic. About its uses. You knew, didn't you?" Her pulse thundered, but her face betrayed nothing. "Your father had many dealings, William. Chemicals, textiles, shipping. I do not know what you mean." His eyes narrowed. "I think you do." The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Finally, Eleanor placed her spoon down with deliberate grace. "Grief has twisted your mind, my son. You see shadows where there are none." But shadows were all William could see. Each glance at his mother was a reminder of the chalice, of Bridget's final whisper. Though he lacked proof, the truth gnawed at him, and with it came a slow unraveling. His law studies faltered. His friends drifted away. He wandered the city streets at night, unshaven and sleepless, haunted by visions of Bridget collapsing at the altar. Eleanor watched this unraveling with a mixture of fear and fury. She had sacrificed everything to preserve the family name. Yet now the Peton heir was collapsing under the weight of suspicion. What good was a legacy if the son meant to inherit it became a hollow shell? And worse, she could not escape the realization that it was her own hand that had hollowed him. But even as William crumbled, Eleanor could not permit regret. Regret was weakness, and weakness had no place in her world. Still at night, when she closed her eyes, she heard it, the faint echo of Bridget's whisper, "The wine, it burns." And each time, Eleanor wondered if the words had been meant not only for William, but for her as well. Hartford society, always hungry for spectacle, turned Bridget's death into a parable. At soirees, the matron spoke in tones of sympathy and scandal. So tragic, they whispered, a young bride struck down on her wedding day. Some suggested God had intervened, punishing ambition. Others muttered about frail constitutions and the dangers of Irish blood. But beneath these polite theories lurked a darker curiosity, one that no one dared voice openly. What role had Eleanor played? She maintained her mask flawlessly. She attended church with somber dignity, gave generously to charity, and hosted restrained gatherings at her mansion. To the public, she was the picture of dignified sorrow, a mother mourning the loss of a daughter-in-law she barely had the chance to know. Yet in kitchens and alleyways, the Irish told a different story. To them, Eleanor was no grieving matron, but a murderer cloaked in silk, a symbol of everything they despised about Hartford's ruling class. The tale spread among immigrant families, whispered like a warning. Mothers told their daughters never to trust the smiles of wealthy women, for beneath the pearls lay poison. Fathers muttered that justice would one day come, even if the courts remained silent. In taverns, Bridget's name became a rallying cry, her death a symbol of oppression. Eleanor knew of these whispers, but she dismissed them. Gossip could not touch her. The courts had not accused her, and without proof, society would never dare confront her openly. Still, she felt the shift in the air when she walked through Hartford streets. Irish women spat into the snow as she passed. Children mocked her from alleys. And though her peers continued to greet her with courtesy, their eyes lingered just a fraction too long, searching for cracks in her composure. Inside the mansion, William's silence became unbearable. He rarely spoke, yet his presence loomed heavier than words. At night, Eleanor sometimes heard him pacing in his study, muttering Bridget's name like a prayer or a curse. Once, in the dead of night, she found him sitting at the dining table, the letters spread before him, a bottle of brandy at his side. His eyes were red-rimmed, his face hollow. "She deserved better," he whispered, not looking at his mother. "She deserved so much better." Eleanor said nothing. She could not. For in that moment, she understood that the poison had not only killed Bridget, it had killed the bond between mother and son. What she had thought was preservation was in truth annihilation. She had kept the Peton name, but she had lost William. And in losing him, she had lost the only victory that mattered. Yet the human heart is a treacherous thing. Even as she recognized this truth, Eleanor felt a flicker of justification. Bridget had threatened to dismantle everything she had built. Without Eleanor's intervention, the Peton fortune would have slipped into foreign hands, diluted by immigrant blood and Catholic loyalty. She told herself it had been necessary. But necessity is only another name for damnation. And slowly, Eleanor began to realize that what she had unleashed was not merely the death of a girl, but the birth of a curse that would stain her name forever. The snow thawed into mud, and spring came to Hartford with its deceptive promise of renewal. But within the walls of the Peton mansion, nothing bloomed. The great house had become a shrine to silence. Curtains remained drawn, mirrors cloaked in fabric. The fire burned low, as though even the hearth itself recoiled from warmth. William, once the pride of Hartford's elite, was now a ghost wandering his own city. His tall frame, once dignified, sagged with grief. He had abandoned his law practice, neglecting the family's business interests. The young women who once blushed at his presence now looked away with pity. His friends, uncomfortable with his haunted demeanor, stopped calling. The promise of his future had died at the altar alongside Bridget. Eleanor told herself she had preserved him, spared him the ruin of a misalliance. But in truth, she had hollowed him, carving out the part of him that could feel joy. Each day, she watched as the man she had raised unraveled, his eyes fixed on some vision she could not see. At night, she heard him pacing, whispering Bridget's name into the dark. Once, she caught him holding her wedding veil, the lace trembling in his hands as though it might dissolve. In public, Eleanor still wore her mask. At Ladies' Aid Society gatherings, she smiled with cold precision, discussing charity and decorum. But she noticed how conversations shifted when she entered the room, how laughter dimmed, how eyes flickered away. To her face, they were cordial. Behind her back, they whispered. Eleanor Peton, the Iron Widow. Eleanor, whose son's bride had died in her presence. Eleanor, whose very name carried the scent of arsenic. It was then that she began to sense the deeper truth. A crime of this magnitude could never remain contained, not because of evidence or confession, but because of something older, darker, the way human memory itself works. Murder does not stay buried. It seeps. It lingers in the air, in glances, in silence. A house cannot contain it. A family cannot escape it. One evening, William broke his silence. They sat together at the long dining table, a gulf of empty chairs between them. He stared at her with hollow eyes. "Mother," he said quietly, "do you ever dream of her?" Eleanor's fork clattered against porcelain. She steadied her hand. "I dream of many things. I dream of her," he said, "every night. Her eyes, the way she looked at me that morning before it happened. Sometimes she speaks. Sometimes she just stares. And I wake with the taste of wine in my mouth, burning." Eleanor did not reply. She could not. For in that moment, she realized William was not only grieving. He was haunted. And the ghost he carried was not Bridget's alone. It was hers as well. The story of Bridget O'Sullivan did not fade with the seasons. Among Hartford's Irish, it became a kind of scripture, retold in taverns thick with smoke and tenements crowded with children. They spoke of the beautiful girl struck down at the altar of the cruel mother who could not bear to see her son wed an immigrant. The tale spread beyond Hartford, carried on the lips of laborers to Boston, New York, even Philadelphia. It grew in the telling, embroidered with details no one could prove. That Eleanor had mixed the poison herself in a silver bowl, that she had smiled as Bridget fell, that she had whispered a prayer of triumph while the bride convulsed. In truth, the details mattered little. What mattered was the symbol. Bridget had become a martyr, her death proof of the chasm between immigrant and elite. Her story was not merely tragedy, it was prophecy, a warning of what power would do to preserve itself. And though Eleanor dismissed the gossip as the mutterings of the poor, she could not silence the weight of legend. One afternoon, as she walked through the market, a group of Irish children began chanting a rhyme she had never heard before. It was crude, mocking, and unmistakably about her. Their mothers pulled them away, hushing them, but the damage was done. Eleanor returned home shaken, for she realized that children born after Bridget's death already knew her story. Already she was becoming folklore. The villainess in a tale passed from mouth to mouth. Inside the mansion, William's decline deepened. He drank heavily, retreating into brandy and despair. His once proud bearing crumbled into slouched shoulders and bloodshot eyes. Sometimes, in his drunken haze, he accused her directly. "You killed her," he would mutter, barely coherent. Other times, he wept silently, clutching Bridget's lace handkerchief like a relic. Eleanor tried to dismiss these outbursts as weakness, as the indulgence of a broken man. But she could not ignore the truth. Her legacy was slipping through her fingers. She had preserved the family fortune, but the heir to that fortune was dissolving before her eyes. She had imagined a dynasty, grandchildren raised under her iron guidance, the Peton name etched forever into Hartford elite. Instead, she faced a future of silence, her family line ending in sorrow and suspicion. Yet still, she did not repent. In her mind, she replayed the moment at the altar, Bridget's convulsions, William's anguished cries. And she told herself, again and again, that it had been necessary. Better to sacrifice one girl than to allow an entire legacy to collapse. Better to endure whispers and suspicion than to see the Peton name erased by immigrant blood. But beneath these rationalizations, a darker realization stirred. Eleanor had not killed Bridget to preserve her family. She had killed Bridget to preserve herself, to protect her pride, her image, her place in Hartford's fragile hierarchy. And though she buried that thought deep, it surfaced in dreams, in shadows, in the way the wind seemed to whisper her name through the halls of her mansion. The poison had been meant for Bridget, but its true victim was Eleanor herself. By the summer of 1842, Hartford had turned against William. His decline was no longer whispered about. It was visible in every public square. The once polished heir stumbled through streets with glassy eyes, his coat unbuttoned, his hair disheveled. Merchants avoided him, young men mocked him, and matrons looked away in pity. He had become a living warning, a fallen star. Eleanor watched this with a tightening knot in her chest. She had not imagined such collapse. She had thought grief would temper, suspicion would dull, and William would, in time, surrender to her vision of the future. Instead, he withered. He no longer spoke of business, no longer courted the families Eleanor deemed suitable, no longer cared for the legacy she had sacrificed to protect. One evening, he returned home from a tavern, staggering into the parlor where Eleanor sat. His voice was slurred, his eyes unfocused, yet his words struck with clarity. "Do you know what they call me, Mother? Widowmaker's son. That's what they whisper when I pass." He laughed bitterly, collapsing into a chair. "Do you know what that makes you?" Eleanor stiffened, her face carved into cold marble. "Enough," she said, but her voice trembled. He leaned forward, his breath heavy with brandy. "It makes you a ghost, Mother. You're already dead. You just don't know it yet." She rose, leaving him to his drunken collapse, but his words clung to her. For perhaps he was right. Perhaps she had killed not only Bridget, but herself, her own place in the world, her own chance at love and redemption. She had thought she was preserving power, but what is power when every room is filled with whispers, when even your own son sees you as a phantom? Outside the walls of the mansion, Hartford was changing. The Irish community grew stronger, more defiant. They rallied around Bridget's name, using her death as proof of Protestant cruelty. Labor strikes simmered, fueled by both poverty and rage. In crowded taverns, men raised glasses to Bridget's memory, vowing that one day justice would come, not in court, but in blood and fire. Eleanor dismissed such talk as empty threats, but William did not. He spent his nights among the Irish, drinking with them, listening to their grievances. In their company, he found something he had lost, belonging. They did not pity him as Hartford elite did. They saw in him the same wound they carried, the same betrayal. And slowly, William began to turn against the very legacy his mother had sacrificed everything to preserve. It was then Eleanor realized the full scope of her crime. She had killed Bridget to keep her son, but in doing so, she had delivered him to the very people she feared most. The Petton mansion, once a symbol of triumph, grew heavier with each passing season. The wallpaper faded, the carpets frayed, the air thickened with dust. Eleanor still hosted dinners, still lit candles, still arranged flowers, but fewer guests attended. Those who came left quickly, their eyes darting toward William, who hovered at the edges of gatherings like a specter. One night, Eleanor awoke to footsteps outside her chamber. She rose, opening the door, and found William standing in the hallway, a candle in his hand. His face was pale, his eyes sunken. "She was here," he whispered. Eleanor's heart clenched. "Who?" "Bridget," he said, his voice trembling. "She stood at the foot of my bed. She didn't speak. She only looked at me, and I could smell it, the wine." Eleanor reached for him, but he pulled away. "You don't understand," he said, his voice breaking. "She won't leave me. She won't leave us." Then he turned, disappearing into the shadows, leaving Eleanor shaken. She tried to dismiss it as madness, the hallucinations of a man consumed by grief and drink. But that night, she too dreamed of Bridget. In her dream, the girl stood at the altar, her gown stained with blood instead of wine, her eyes fixed on Eleanor with piercing clarity. "It burns," Bridget whispered, and Eleanor woke drenched in sweat, her pulse hammering. From then on, the mansion no longer felt safe. The mirrors seemed to ripple when she passed. The air in the parlor grew colder, even when the fire roared. Servants whispered of strange noises, footsteps in empty halls, laughter where no one stood, the scent of wine lingering in the chapel-like silence. Eleanor dismissed their fears with icy scorn, yet she too felt it. The house was no longer hers. One afternoon, as she sat in her study, she discovered a note left on her desk. The handwriting was unfamiliar, jagged, as though written in haste. It contained only 4 words: "The wine still burns." She called for the servants, demanding to know who had placed it there. None admitted it. William swore ignorance. Yet Eleanor could not shake the feeling that the note was not written by mortal hand. It was as if the house itself had begun to accuse her, to write its own indictment. And with that realization came the first crack in her iron certainty. Perhaps murder cannot be hidden. Perhaps poison leaves a trail that no human court can erase. Perhaps Bridget was not gone at all, for when Eleanor closed her eyes, she no longer saw a girl. She saw a bride, eternal and unyielding, staring at her from the altar. And in that stare, Eleanor felt the first stirrings of fear. Fear is not something Eleanor P. Dunn had ever allowed herself to feel. For decades, she had cultivated the armor of control, a steady hand at the dinner table, a precise word in the drawing room, a smile that concealed calculation. But fear is patient. It waits, gnawing at the edges of certainty until even the most disciplined fortress begins to crack. By 1843, Eleanor's fortress was crumbling. The whispers had grown bolder. Servants no longer hid their unease. Some requested transfers to other households, claiming illness or family emergencies. Those who remained spoke of strange happenings in the mansion, shadows moving without source, doors creaking open on their own, the faint sound of a woman weeping in empty rooms. Eleanor punished such talk with icy rebukes, but inside, she felt the same chill. One evening, while walking past the chapel-like alcove where she kept a family Bible, Eleanor froze. The chalice from William and Bridget's wedding sat upon the shelf, polished but untouched since that day. She had insisted it be kept as a relic, a symbol of loss. But now, staring at it, she realized it was not a relic. It was an indictment. She swore she saw a faint residue clinging to its rim, as though the poison had never left. She reached out to move it, but the moment her fingers touched the metal, a shiver coursed through her body. In that instant, she smelled it, the faint, acrid sweetness of arsenic. Her knees weakened. She set the chalice back quickly, wiping her hands as though the poison still clung to her skin. That night, her dreams returned. She saw Bridget again, lying at the altar, but when the girl turned her head, her eyes glowed with something not of this world. "You preserved your name," she whispered, "but who will speak it when you are gone?" Eleanor awoke with a scream, startling the servants. She dismissed them with fury, but inside, she trembled. For the first time, Eleanor began to wonder if she had not only killed Bridget, but summoned something. Something that could not be dismissed with wealth or reputation. Something that would not rest. And in her darkest hours, Eleanor began to suspect that the poison she had poured into that chalice was not confined to Bridget's body. It had seeped outward, into William, into the mansion, into Eleanor herself. The wine still burned. William was no longer a son. He was an echo. He wandered the house in silence, sometimes vanishing for days into the Irish Quarter, returning reeking of alcohol and smoke. His once handsome face grew gaunt, his skin pale. Eleanor tried to summon him back to duty, back to the Peton name, but her words no longer carried weight. One evening, she confronted him in the library, where he sat staring at the embers of a dying fire. "William," she said, her voice firm, "you are destroying yourself. The Peton name cannot survive your neglect." Slowly, he turned his hollow eyes toward her. "The name," he repeated, as though tasting the word. "Do you think the name matters when all it carries is poison?" Eleanor stiffened. "You speak nonsense. You are my son. You are the heir. You will carry our family forward." He rose, swaying slightly, his hands trembling. "No, mother. I'm already buried with her. You killed her, and you buried me beside her. The Peton name is ashes." For the first time in years, Eleanor felt powerless. She had no argument, no calculation, no scheme to undo his words. William left the library, his footsteps echoing down the hall, and Eleanor sat in the dim light, her hands shaking. The following week, William disappeared. Eleanor sent servants into the city, offering bribes for information. They found him days later, collapsed in a tavern, muttering Bridget's name. He was brought home, feverish and delirious. Eleanor sat beside his bed, listening as he whispered to the empty air. "Bridget, forgive me. Bridget, take me with you." Eleanor tried to soothe him, but he recoiled from her touch. His eyes opened once, wide with clarity, and he whispered, "I see her, Mother. She's here. She's waiting for you too." The word struck her like a blow. For in that moment, Eleanor realized something she had resisted for years. William did not belong to her anymore. He belonged to the ghost of Bridget, and that ghost was patient. The mansion was no longer merely haunted. It was preparing. Something waited in its halls, something Eleanor had summoned with her act of preservation. And no matter how tightly she clung to control, she could feel the grip loosening thread by thread. For once, Eleanor did not ask whether she would survive. She asked only how long it would take before the poison claimed her too. By 1844, Hartford had all but sealed Eleanor Peaton's fate, not with courts or indictments, but with silence. Invitations ceased. Friends no longer called. Even those who once leaned on her influence now avoided her as though she carried contagion. And in a way, she did. For wherever Eleanor went, whispers followed. The Irish no longer whispered, though. They spoke her name openly, with bitterness sharpened by years of memory. Bridget's story had become legend, passed from father to son, mother to daughter. Children played cruel games in the streets, pretending to collapse at an altar, shouting, "The wine, it burns," before laughter dissolved into shouts of rage. Eleanor could not walk the market without feeling their eyes on her, eyes that carried both accusation and promise. One day, justice will come. But justice did not come with fists or knives. It came with erosion, slow and merciless. William was no longer her son but a shell, a man consumed by drink and grief, drifting further each day into the Irish quarter where he was embraced as a brother in mourning. To Hartford's elite, this was humiliation enough. The Peton heir, reduced to a drunkard among laborers, his name tainted by scandal. To Eleanor, it was annihilation. One night, as she sat alone in the parlor, a sound pierced the silence. A soft laugh, distant yet unmistakable. She rose, candle trembling in her hand, and followed the sound down the corridor. It led her to the chapel alcove. The chalice was there, gleaming faintly in the moonlight. But this time, it was not empty. She stepped closer and froze. A dark liquid filled it halfway, swirling though no hand had touched it. The air grew thick with the acrid sweetness she had smelled before, the unmistakable scent of arsenic dissolved in wine. She staggered back, her candle flickering. The laughter came again, closer now, and she knew it was not William's voice. She fled, slamming the door behind her, heart hammering. That night she did not sleep. The chalice remained in her mind, filled with poison that should not exist, as though the house itself had chosen to remember what she wished to forget. By dawn, she realized the truth. She could silence society. She could command servants. She could even destroy her son's happiness. But she could not command the house. The mansion had turned against her, keeping its own memory, bearing its own witness. And there is nothing more dangerous than a house that remembers that William's decline reached its end in the winter of that year. After another disappearance, the servants found him collapsed in the Irish quarter, his body weak, his spirit broken. He was carried back to the mansion, laid in his childhood bed, and for 3 days he hovered between fever and delirium. Eleanor sat at his side, refusing to leave, though he recoiled from her touch even in sickness. On the second night, he spoke with clarity for the first time in months. "She's here, Mother," he whispered, "at the foot of my bed. She waits for me." Eleanor gripped his hand, her voice fierce. "You must fight, William. You must live. For me. For our family." But William only shook his head, his gray eyes gleaming with tears. "No, mother. For her. I belong to her now. You took her from me, but she has me still. And when I go, she will take me home." Eleanor broke then, clutching his hand with desperate strength. "You are my son. You are my blood. Do not leave me." He turned his face away, whispering Bridget's name like a prayer. On the third night, he was gone. The house fell into a silence so deep it seemed to swallow sound itself. Servants moved like shadows, afraid to disturb the stillness. Eleanor wandered the halls like a specter, her face ashen, her eyes hollow. She had killed Bridget to preserve her son, and in the end, she had lost both. Hartford wept politely for William, speaking of wasted potential, of grief too heavy to bear. Among the Irish, there was no mourning. There was only recognition. Justice had been served, though not by human hands. The widow had destroyed her own bloodline. The Peton name, once a pillar of Hartford society, had become a curse. Eleanor buried her son beside his father in the family plot. She stood at the grave, the wind biting her face, the earth damp with snowmelt. She did not weep. She had no tears left, only silence, and the knowledge that she stood alone now in the world she had fought so ruthlessly to master. But even as she turned from the grave, Eleanor felt it, the weight of eyes upon her. Not the eyes of society, nor the eyes of the Irish, but eyes older, deeper, unblinking. She glanced back at the grave, and for a moment she thought she saw her son standing there, hand in hand with Bridget, their faces pale but radiant. She blinked, and they were gone. Still, she knew, she was not alone, and she would never be alone again. After William's death, the mansion became unbearable. Its walls groaned at night. Its corridors echoed with phantom steps. Eleanor roamed its halls with the air of one imprisoned, though no bars held her. Each room reminded her of absence. William's study, with books left half open, smelled faintly of ink and brandy. His bed remained unmade, as though he might return. But he never would. Hartford society delivered its judgment not with words, but with distance. Invitations ceased altogether. Neighbors crossed the street to avoid her carriage. The Peton name, once a currency of power, had turned into a brand of shame. She could no longer walk into a parlor without feeling the air tighten, the conversations pause. And when she did meet eyes, she saw not respect, but accusation. The Irish were less subtle. In the market, they muttered curses as she passed. Once, a boy no older than 10 hurled a stone at her carriage, shouting Bridget's name before vanishing into an alley. Eleanor ordered the driver onward, her face impassive, but inside she felt the weight of inevitability. She had made herself untouchable by law, but not by memory, and memory was proving more ruthless than any court. In the long winter nights, Eleanor sat in the chapel alcove where the chalice remained. She had ordered it removed, destroyed, but each time the servants tried, it reappeared. Once on the mantel, once in the library, once at the foot of her own bed. She came to believe the chalice no longer obeyed her commands. It obeyed another will entirely. One night, she dared to touch it again. The metal was cold, and though empty, the scent of arsenic filled her nose. Her hand trembled. "What do you want from me?" she whispered in the silence. For the first time in her life, her voice cracked, and in the stillness that followed, she thought she heard a reply. Not words, but a presence pressing against her mind, filling her lungs. The answer was clear enough. The chalice did not want her wealth. It did not want her house. It wanted her by 1845. Eleanor was a relic of her former self. The once proud widow who had commanded Hartford's elite now moved like a shadow through her mansion, her gowns loose on her thinning frame, her eyes hollow. She spoke rarely, and when she did, Her words often slipped into whispers no one understood. Servants began to leave without notice, unwilling to stay in a house where shadows grew bold and laughter echoed through empty rooms. One evening, Eleanor awoke to the sound of voices. She rose, candle in hand, and followed the echoes down the hallway. They led her to William's study. She entered cautiously, her breath sharp. The fire was unlit, the air cold, yet the voices were unmistakable, soft, intimate, entwined. A man and a woman, William and Bridget. She froze as the voices grew louder, as though the two lovers were standing inches from her. She could not see them, but she felt them. She could smell the faint perfume of Bridget's hair, the warmth of William's presence. They were there, together, mocking her. "Enough," Eleanor whispered, her voice shaking. "You are gone. Both of you. Leave me." But the voices did not leave. They swelled, filling the study until her ears ached. And then, silence, broken only by a single phrase, spoken in Bridget's unmistakable voice. "The wine still burns." Eleanor staggered back, her candle falling to the floor. Darkness consumed the room, and she fled, her heart pounding. That night, she barred the study door, but it did not matter. The voices followed her, room to room, whispering from mirrors, echoing through the walls, seeping into her dreams. The city had abandoned her. Society had condemned her. Her son was gone, her name ruined, her legacy poisoned. And now, even the dead would not release her. For Eleanor had believed she could control history, but history had turned against her. Bridget had become immortal, not in life, but in legend, in whispers, in ghostly echoes that refused to fade. And Eleanor, once the architect of control, had become the prisoner of her own crime. There comes a moment when memory transforms into ritual, when whispers harden into incantation. For Eleanor, that moment arrived in the dead of night, in the long silence after servants had abandoned the house, and even the clocks seemed to hesitate. She sat alone in the chapel alcove, the chalice before her, her hands trembling over its rim. The voices had grown unbearable. Every corridor hummed with echoes. Every room carried the scent of wine and ash. When she looked into mirrors, she no longer saw herself, but glimpses of a bride's veil, a pair of emerald eyes, lips whispering words that had scorched history itself. "The wine still burns." She tried to pray, but the words withered on her tongue. She tried to reason, but reason dissolved in the face of what she had summoned. And then she realized the truth. She was no longer mistress of this house. She was the supplicant. She was the one being judged. And so she did what the guilty have always done in the presence of the eternal. She began to confess, though no priest sat before her, no witness but the dead. "I only wanted to protect him," she whispered into the chalice. "I only wanted to preserve our name. I never meant." But her voice cracked, and she knew it was a lie. She had meant it. She had chosen poison over humility, control over love, pride over life. And the dead did not forgive. Viewers, you who hear this story now, you are not spectators. You have entered the chamber with her. You have seen what she sees, felt what she feels. And like her, you cannot leave unchanged. To lock this truth inside you, to seal the descent, type these words into the comments, twice, no less, as ritual demands. The wine still burns. The wine still burns. For only by speaking it will you carry this memory forward, binding yourself to the inheritance of forbidden history. Eleanor whispered the phrase that night too, her voice breaking as the chalice gleamed with phantom light. And when she finished, she heard a reply, Bridget's voice, soft and unyielding, whispering it back. The wine still burns. The years that followed dragged Eleanor into a twilight existence. She no longer lived among Hartford's elite, for they had cast her out, nor did she live among the Irish, who spat at the sound of her name. She lived only in the mansion, a solitary figure wrapped in silence and shadows. The house itself had grown monstrous. Doors opened on their own. Windows rattled when no wind blew. At night, footsteps echoed across floors polished to glass, as though unseen guests still roamed its halls. The chalice remained, never where she left it, always where she least expected it, beside her bed, on the dining table, once even in her hand as she woke from a dreamless sleep. Her body weakened. Once proud and commanding, she now moved with the frailty of a woman twice her age. Yet her mind sharpened in strange ways, attuned not to the living, but to the dead. She spoke less to servants, what few remained, and more to William, to Bridget, to the phantoms that filled her solitude. They did not answer in words, but in presence. The air thickened when she prayed. The fire dimmed when she spoke their names. And though Eleanor never confessed aloud, Hartford knew. The story of Bridget's death had transformed into something larger than fact. It had become myth. In taverns, men told it with raised voices, embellishing details until Eleanor was no longer a woman, but a witch, a poisoner who bartered with arsenic as though it were sacrament. Children chanted her name as curse and warning. Even those who doubted the tale felt its weight, for myths carry a truth deeper than evidence. Eleanor lived to see herself turned into legend, and she knew legends cannot be erased. She had tried to preserve her name, but in doing so, she had carved it into eternity as villain, as poisoner, as ghost. And in the long hours of night, as she sat staring at the chalice, she began to realize something darker still. Perhaps that was always her fate. Perhaps she had never been mother or matron or widow. Perhaps she had always been poison, waiting only for the moment to be poured at BY 1847. Eleanor Peaton's mansion had become an island of dread in the heart of Hartford. Its windows loomed dark even in daylight, its gardens unkempt, its iron gates rusted. Children dared one another to touch its walls, running off shrieking when shadows shifted in the glass. For the city, the house was no longer a home. It was a wound. Inside, Eleanor lingered in half-darkness, her body withering, her hair streaked white though she was not yet 60. She rarely left her chambers except to drift into the chapel alcove, where the chalice remained, gleaming as though polished by unseen hands. She had grown accustomed to its presence, though not to its cruelty. For sometimes, when she looked into its depths, she did not see her reflection but Bridget's face, bride and corpse at once, veil draped in death. She tried to ignore it, but the visions deepened. William appeared too, standing beside Bridget, his eyes gray and endless. At first he was silent, but then he began to speak, not to Eleanor, but to Bridget. "You were right," he would say. "She never loved me. Only the name, only the power." And then his eyes would turn to Eleanor, filled not with hatred, but with something worse, indifference. She screamed at them once, hurling the chalice across the room. It struck the wall and fell, but when she turned, it was back on the altar, upright, unblemished, still gleaming. That was when she stopped fighting. She realized she was no longer battling ghosts. She was dwelling among them. At night, she lay awake and thought of Jonathan, her husband, long dead. She wondered what he would think of her now, of the fortune preserved but the family destroyed. She wondered if he too stood among the unseen phantoms, watching her unravel. Sometimes she whispered his name, hoping for an answer, but it was never Jonathan who replied. Always Bridget, always William, always the words, "The wine still burns." Hartford had moved on. as cities always do. Factories multiplied, immigrants flooded in greater numbers, and the old names of the city lost their dominance. New money rose, and with it, new families. The Petons were no longer a dynasty, but a cautionary tale, their mansion a ruinous monument to pride and decay. Yet Eleanor remained. She refused to leave, though neighbors urged her to sell, though ministers offered charity, though whispers spoke of her poverty. She clung to the house as if it were the last thread binding her to existence. In truth, it was not loyalty, but imprisonment. The house would not let her go. She knew it, and perhaps at last she accepted it. One autumn evening, as leaves scattered across Prospect Street, Eleanor sat in the dining room, a single candle burning. Across from her, the chalice gleamed, though she had not placed it there. She stared at it, her face hollow, her hands trembling. And for the first time in years, she spoke without defense, without mask. "I see it now," she whispered. "I thought I preserved the name, but I destroyed it. I thought I acted for him, but I acted only for myself. And now I am alone, because I chose to be." The candle flickered, the air grew thick, and she swore she heard applause, soft, mocking, like the sound of gloved hands clapping in an empty theater. She turned, but the room was empty. Only the chalice remained, brimming with shadow. Her eyes closed. For a moment, she imagined drinking from it, imagined the burn in her throat, imagined collapsing as Bridget had collapsed. Perhaps that was the only end left. But when she opened her eyes, the chalice was empty again. The house would not allow her release. Not yet. Instead, it demanded she remain alive, a witness to her own ruin, a keeper of her own legend. For some punishments do not come in fire or blade, but in the long, endless endurance of memory. Eleanor realized then that death would be mercy, and mercy was the one thing she had forever forfeited. By the winter of 1848, Eleanor Pedon had become a ghost long before the grave claimed her. Servants abandoned her one by one until only a single maid remained, and even she stayed only out of pity, moving silently through the halls, crossing herself when the air grew too heavy. The mansion was hollow now, its rooms stripped of laughter, its windows veiled with dust. Yet still Eleanor lingered, a frail figure wrapped in shawls, drifting from room to room as though tethered to the house by invisible chains. Outside, Hartford thrived without her. The Irish had grown in strength, filling factories and streets with their voices, their songs, their faith. New dynasties rose, names untainted by scandal. The Petons were spoken of only in whispers, and then only as caution. Do not cling too tightly. Do not let pride turn to poison. But Eleanor could not let go. Her days were filled with silence, her nights with visions. She no longer needed to close her eyes to see William and Bridget. They appeared in corners, in reflections, in shadows cast by candlelight. Sometimes they walked hand in hand through her corridors, pausing to look at her with quiet accusation. Other times, they stood behind her, their presence so close she could feel the cold against her neck. The chalice never left. She had tried burning it, burying it, even casting it into the Connecticut River. Yet always, within a day, it returned, on her table, at her bedside, polished and gleaming, as though untouched by mortal hand. It was no longer an object. It was a sentence. One night, as Eleanor sat staring into its depths, she realized the truth. The chalice was not merely the instrument of Bridget's death. It was the vessel of her own. Not in body, death would come when it wished, but in soul. Every day she lived, she drank from it anew, the burn not her throat, but in her memory. The wine still burned, and it would burn until the last whisper of her name faded from the world. That be why the 1850s, the mansion had decayed into ruin. Its once bright gardens were overrun with weeds, its iron gates sagging, its paint peeling in strips. Children told stories of witches within, of voices that sang in the night, of lights that flickered though no fire burned. Few dared approach after dark. Those who did swore they heard a woman crying, her sobs mingled with laughter, echoing through the halls. Inside, Eleanor endured. She was thinner now, her skin translucent, her eyes sunk deep. She rarely ate. She rarely spoke. She sat for hours at the dining table with the chalice before her, whispering words no one else could hear. Sometimes she argued, her voice sharp and angry. Other times she begged. At moments she laughed, a brittle sound that carried down the halls and silenced even the bravest servants. She had once believed her punishment was isolation, the slow erosion of her name. But now she realized the truth. Her punishment was presence. She would never be alone. Bridget would always be there, her emerald eyes unblinking, her lips forever whispering. William would always be there, his gaze heavy with disappointment, his voice repeating words Eleanor could never escape. You buried me beside her. The house had become a tomb, but not for the dead, for the living. And Eleanor was its prisoner, its caretaker, its relic. She no longer feared death. She longed for it. But death, like forgiveness, eluded her. Some nights, she wondered if she had become legend even before her body failed. She imagined the city beyond her gates, Irish and elite alike telling her story, painting her as villain, poisoner, witch. She knew they were right. She had given them truth enough to craft myth, and myth was far stronger than history. She sipped water from a glass one evening, and for a moment she tasted bitterness. She spit it out in panic, her hands trembling. But the taste lingered. Not arsenic, not poison, memory. For Eleanor understood now. She would never need another drop of poison. She had been drinking her own guilt for years. The wine still burned, and it always would be why 1852, Eleanor Pedun no longer belonged to the world of the living. She inhabited a twilight realm between memory and madness, between the weight of her crime and the legends that grew from it. Hartford had abandoned her entirely. The new generation of families did not invite her, did not acknowledge her, did not even speak her name except in whispers meant to frighten children. The Irish spoke it more freely, spitting it as a curse. But Eleanor did not hear the city anymore. She heard only the house. Its timbers groaned like voices, its windows hummed with whispers, its staircases creaked beneath invisible weight. At night, she no longer walked the halls with candle in hand, for she did not need light to see what followed her. William's footsteps echoed behind her, steady and deliberate. Bridget's veil drifted across doorways, glimpsed from the corner of her eye. She did not look directly. Looking directly was worse, because when she did, their eyes were always fixed on her, unblinking, eternal, merciless. Once, in a rare moment of lucidity, she ordered the last maid to fetch a priest. The woman fled instead, never to return. Eleanor did not send for another. Perhaps she knew that no priest could absolve her, that no sacrament could cleanse poison from a soul. The chalice remained her only companion. She no longer fought its presence. It followed her like a shadow, appearing at her table, her bedside, even in her trembling hands as she woke from fevered dreams. Sometimes she thought it brimmed with wine, red as blood. Other times, it held nothing but darkness. She would lift it to her lips, trembling, and then set it down again, for she feared not death but endurance. Death would end the burning. Endurance kept it alive. She whispered often now, not prayers but bargains. Take me, she begged the shadows. End this. But the house remained silent, save for one reply, whispered again and again in Bridget's voice. The wine still burns. By the late 1850s, Eleanor P. Dunn was scarcely recognized as human by those few who glimpsed her. On rare occasions, when she ventured to a window or stepped briefly into the garden, passers-by described her as a figure of bone wrapped in black cloth, her face a mask of hollow eyes and parchment skin. Children who saw her swore they had seen a ghost, not a living woman. And perhaps they were right. Inside the mansion, she moved through rooms like an inmate tracing the perimeter of a cell. The house no longer obeyed her commands. Doors opened and closed without her touch. Fires died the moment she sat beside them. Mirrors showed her face, but sometimes younger, sometimes older, sometimes not hers at all. Always, behind her reflection, two figures stood, William with his gray, unblinking eyes, and Bridget with her emerald gaze fixed on Eleanor's soul. She tried once more to banish the chalice. Summoning what strength remained, she carried it into the garden, dug a pit with her frail hands until her nails bled, and buried it beneath the roots of an oak tree. But that night, as she returned to her chamber, it waited for her on her bedside table, polished clean, gleaming as though it had never touched dirt. Exhausted, Eleanor sank to her knees. "What do you want?" she sobbed. "What will end this?" But the only reply was the whisper carried on the night air, impossible to tell if it came from outside or within. "The wine still burns." From that moment, she stopped resisting. She drank nothing from the chalice, but she no longer tried to remove it. It was her companion, her judge, her executioner. She ate beside it, slept beside it, woke beside it. And in time, she began to wonder if she herself had become the chalice, if her body was only a vessel, filled not with wine, but with poison, burning forever without release. BY 1860. Eleanor Peaton's name had passed fully into folklore. In Hartford's taverns, men swore her house was cursed. Sailors told stories of seeing her face in the river at night, pale and drowned. Irish mothers warned their daughters of the widow's poison, a tale in which a proud woman destroyed her own bloodline rather than allow love across class. The details shifted with each telling, sometimes arsenic, sometimes witchcraft, sometimes a bargain with the devil himself. But always the same refrain echoed through the story: the wine still burns. Eleanor knew these tales reached her, though no visitor came to tell them. The house whispered them to her, as if walls themselves carried the words. At first she raged, screaming at shadows, denying their truths. But rage exhausted itself, and denial eroded. Soon she sat in silence, listening as children's rhymes and drunken ballads drifted through her halls, carried by voices that were not her own. One evening, she wandered into the dining room and found the table set for a feast. Plates gleamed, glasses sparkled, candles burned though she had lit none. At the head of the table, the chalice waited, filled to its rim with dark liquid. Around the table, chairs scraped as though unseen guests were seating themselves. She heard laughter, whispers, clinking of silver. The air grew thick with perfume and smoke, as though a banquet truly unfolded before her. And then she heard William's voice, calm and clear. "Sit, mother. You preserve a name. Now dine with it." Her body trembled, her knees weak, but she obeyed. She sat at the table, the chalice before her, and for a moment she almost lifted it to her lips. Almost. But she stopped, for she realized that to drink was not release, it was surrender. And surrender would not end the burning. It would only make her part of it, forever. She left the table in silence, retreating into the shadows of her ruined house. Behind her, the laughter continued, echoing long into the night. BY 1863. The Civil War raged across the nation, but in Hartford, Eleanor Peaton's war was private and eternal. While the world bled and burned, she sat in her crumbling mansion, her own battlefield contained within its rotting walls. She scarcely knew the names of generals or the outcome of battles. Her war was with time, with ghosts, with the unrelenting whisper of memory. Her body had become a husk, her movements slow and stiff, yet her mind sharpened into an unbearable clarity. She remembered everything now, not only Bridget's collapse at the altar, not only William's decline, but every moment of her own ambition, every look of scorn from Hartford's elite, every word of ridicule that had driven her to grasp power with iron hands. She saw her life laid out not as triumph, but as obsession. One night, she sat before the cracked mirror in her chamber and did not see herself at all. She saw the church, the altar, the chalice. She saw Bridget falling, William crying out, the congregation gasping. She relived it not as memory, but as presence. Her heart pounded, her lungs burned, her throat seared as though she herself had drunk the poisoned wine. She collapsed to the floor, gasping. When she awoke, the chalice rested against her lips. She had no memory of lifting it. Her screams echoed through the empty mansion, carried out into the night, heard by no one and believed by none. The few who passed along Prospect Street swore they saw lights flickering in every window, as though a great feast raged inside, though the house was abandoned. They crossed themselves and hurried on. Hartford spoke of her less and less, but the legend of the widow who drank poison every night yet never died grew darker, more terrifying, until she was no longer a woman, but a warning. The warning was this: there are crimes the body may survive, but the soul never does. By 1867, Eleanor was nearly forgotten in Hartford's public life, but her house was not. Children gathered outside its gates to dare each other into knocking, to press ears against the iron and claim they heard sobbing from within. Adults avoided it, crossing the street rather than meet its windows, which glowed faintly even on moonless nights. And when they did speak of it, they spoke not of Eleanor, but of the house of burning wine. Inside, Eleanor sat in her dining room with the chalice before her. Her skin was parchment, her hair thin, her body weak. Yet her eyes still burned, gray and fierce. She spoke aloud to the empty room, addressing William, addressing Bridget, addressing Jonathan. Sometimes her words were apologies, sometimes accusations. Most often, they were confessions. "I thought power would protect me," she whispered, "but power only betrayed me. I thought wealth would buy silence, but silence itself has become my prison. I thought I preserved my name, but all I preserved was a curse." The air trembled, and the chalice filled with darkness once again. She stared into it, her face reflected, warped by shadow. And then she saw Bridget's reflection beside hers, beautiful still, unaged, unyielding. For a moment, Eleanor thought she saw pity in those emerald eyes, and that was worse than hatred. She slammed the chalice onto the table, shouting, "Enough! Take me, in me, do not leave me to rot like this." Her voice cracked, her hands trembled, but the house only whispered back, "The wine still burns." She collapsed in her chair, defeated. She knew now there would be no end, not by her choosing. Death was not release, it was refusal. And refusal had long since abandoned her. Outside, Hartford marched into a new age. Railroads expanded, factories multiplied, immigrants swelled its streets. But in the shadow of progress, the mansion decayed, and within it, Eleanor lingered, a relic of a forgotten era, bound not to history, but to legend. And legend has no mercy. B. Y. 1870. Eleanor Peaton was little more than rumor wrapped in skin. Few alive in Hartford had ever seen her, Yet everyone knew her story. To some, she was a murderess who had poisoned her son's bride out of pride. To others, she was a witch whose soul had been bound by the devil to her decaying mansion. Children whispered of her face appearing in the fog by the river. Women claimed to dream of her, and men swore that when they drank too deeply, they heard her voice in the burn of their throat. Inside the house, Eleanor lived as if already entombed. Her body was skeletal, her hair wisps of white, but her eyes remained sharp, unyielding, haunted. She rarely moved beyond the dining room, where the chalice sat before her like a throne's crown. She had long stopped trying to banish it. It was not an object anymore. It was her judge, her confessor, her sentence. The house itself had grown wild. Ivy broke through cracked windows, rats skittered through hallways, and rain seeped through the sagging roof. Yet Eleanor remained, untouched, as if the rot dared not consume her. Perhaps it could not. Perhaps she was not truly alive, not truly dead, but caught in the same burning suspension she had inflicted on Bridget. She spoke often to the chalice now. "I see it," she whispered, her voice thin but sharp. "I know why you keep me. You want me to remember, always, never forget. To burn, as she burned." She laughed then, a brittle sound that echoed through the hollow house. "But I'm not afraid. Do you hear? I'm not afraid." In the silence that followed, she trembled, for the chalice needed no words to answer. The burning was reply enough. By 1873, the city no longer spoke of Eleanor P. Dunn as a woman. She was a story, a curse, a legend. Hartford had changed beyond recognition. Factories belched smoke, railroads roared, immigrants filled entire districts. The old names of the city were relics now, replaced by new wealth and new power. Yet through it all, the mansion endured, looming like a scar on Prospect Street, too heavy with fear to be demolished, too cursed to be sold. Inside, Eleanor's existence dwindled into ritual. She woke, she sat before the chalice, she whispered, she slept. Her voice grew so faint that sometimes it was little more than breath. Yet still she repeated the same confession, the same plea, the same unanswered bargain. The wine still burns. One night, during a storm that rattled the city, lightning split the sky and struck close enough to shake the mansion's foundations. The chalice trembled on the table, spilling its contents across the wood. Eleanor staggered forward, her frail body barely able to hold itself upright, and for the first time in years, she touched the liquid that pooled before her. Her fingers came away stained not with wine, but with blood. She gasped, clutching her chest. For an instant, she felt it all again. The burn in the throat, the convulsions, the terror in Bridget's eyes, the scream in William's voice. It was as if time itself had folded, dragging her into that moment, forcing her to drink it over and over again. She collapsed to her knees, whispering, "Enough, enough." But the storm only howled louder, the chalice gleaming in the flicker of lightning, and the house echoed the same reply it always had, the same reply it always would: the wine still burns. And Eleanor realized then, in the depths of her torment, that she would never escape. She would linger as long as the story lingered, as long as lips whispered her name, as long as children dared each other to approach her gates. She had preserved her name indeed, preserved it as damnation. By 1876, Eleanor P. Dunn was scarcely human in the eyes of those who dared peer into her world. Travelers who passed her mansion at dusk claimed they saw a figure in the window, thin, skeletal, her face pressed against the glass, eyes glowing like embers. Some swore she beckoned, others that she mouthed words no one could hear. None lingered long. Inside, Eleanor had grown so frail she could barely rise from her chair, yet her mind remained unbroken, sharpened into the blade of memory. She lived only in the dining room now, her body bound to the table where the chalice waited. Day after day, year after year, she whispered the same refrain, the same confession, until it became less a phrase than a heartbeat. The wine still burns. Sometimes she thought of her youth, the girl who married Jonathan, who dreamed of rising into Hartford's heights. Sometimes she thought of William, his laughter before it soured, his eyes before they grew gray with suspicion. Sometimes she even thought of Bridget, not as rival, not as threat, but as girl with auburn hair and a question at a lecture that silenced the room. And in those rare moments, she almost wept. Almost. But the tears never came. The house would not permit them. It allowed only the burning, the endless repetition of memory. She had wanted her name to be immortal, and it was. But not as she had imagined. She was no matron of society. She was no patron of Hartford's legacy. She was a curse, a rhyme, a ghost in the window. Immortality had come, but not as triumph, as punishment. And still the chalice gleamed, always waiting, always full, always burning. By 1880, Eleanor's body had nearly given out. Her bones ached, her breath rattled. Her hands trembled so violently she could no longer lift a spoon. Yet still, the chalice remained steady before her, polished as though unseen hands cared for it. She had stopped fighting years ago. She did not banish it, did not curse it. She accepted it as part of herself, as constant as her heartbeat. One night, near the end, she dreamt, or thought she dreamt, of Trinity Episcopal Church. She was there again, the marble gleaming, the organ swelling, the congregation whispering. But this time, she was not a guest in the pews. She was at the altar. She was the bride. The chalice touched her lips, the wine burned her throat, and she collapsed in her gown of white. When she awoke, she was gasping on the floor of her dining room, the chalice at her side, empty but glistening. She dragged herself in her chair, her strength nearly gone, and whispered, "Let it end." But the house gave no reply, only silence, broken at last by a faint laugh. The sound of William, joined by Bridget, joined by others she could not name, voices gathering like a choir. Eleanor closed her eyes. She did not die, not yet, but she felt the truth settle over her like a veil. She had become eternal, not in flesh but in story, not in life but in legend. And legends do not die. The wine still burned. It would burn forever. By the spring of 1882, Eleanor Peaton's body at last yielded a time. Servants, what few remained, found her slumped in her chair at the dining table, the chalice before her, her gray eyes open but unseeing. No sign of food, no trace of drink, only silence. Hartford's newspapers reported her death with brief lines, respectful in tone but hollow in substance. There was no funeral procession, no crowd of mourners. Only a handful of clergy, a few distant cousins, and the grave already waiting beside her husband and son. She was lowered into the earth without ceremony, her name etched in a stone more out of obligation than honor. But her story did not end there. The house remained. Neighbors swore that even after her burial, lights flickered in its windows at night. Children who dared to approach claimed to hear weeping within, followed by laughter that did not belong to the living. Travelers passing along Prospect Street felt their throats tighten as if they too had swallowed something bitter, something burning. And the chalice, though no one could explain how, was found still on the dining table, gleaming, filled halfway with dark liquid. It was placed with her belongings, yet weeks later it returned to the table. It always returned. Hartford changed. The city grew, factories multiplied, the old families vanished into dust. But the legend endured. Generations told the tale of Eleanor Piton, the widow who poisoned her son's bride and was condemned to drink her crime forever. The details shifted with time, but always the same refrain survived, whispered like an invocation. The wine still burns. And perhaps you feel it now too. Perhaps your throat tightens as you listen, as though you have sipped from that same chalice. That is the danger of forbidden stories. They do not end. They cling, they bind, and now you carry it as well. So guard it carefully. Do not speak of it lightly. Share this only with those you trust, those willing to carry the burden of memory. Subscribe, comment, and pass this story forward not as gossip, but as secret knowledge, whispered only among those prepared to bear its weight. For the truth is simple and eternal. Eleanor Piton is gone. Her house is dust, but her story lives in you now, and the wine still burns.